All right, let's talk about one of the strangest, most tense periods in all of modern history, the Cold War. For decades, it was like the entire world was one giant chess match between two superpowers, and we're going to break down exactly how that game was played.
So here's the big question, right? After World War II, you've got the United States and the Soviet Union, the two undisputed heavyweights left standing. But instead of going head-to-head, they fought this shadow war for almost half a century that touched literally every corner of the globe. So how on earth did they fight a global war without ever actually declaring war on each other?
Well, the first moves on this global chessboard were made in Europe, specifically in Germany. The alliance that had won World War II shattered almost immediately, and new battle lines were drawn, not with armies, but with ideology, right through the heart of the continent.
And this is where things got really tense, right away. See, Berlin was split, just like Germany was. In 1948, the Soviets decided to just cut off West Berlin, hoping to starve it into submission. But the Allies didn't send tanks, they sent planes. For almost a year, the Berlin airlift kept the city alive. This whole crisis, though, it all pointed in one direction, the building of that infamous wall.
And this number, this is why they built it. 2.5 million. Just think about that. That's how many East Germans looked at life in the communist East, looked over at the capitalist West, and just left. It was a humiliating public relations disaster for the Soviets and a massive brain drain. So they did the only thing they could think of. They walled their own people.
So, with the line drawn in the sand or, in concrete in Berlin, the conflict started to go global. This was the moment where it became a you're either with us or you're against us situation, and the whole world started choosing sides.
And here they are, the two teams. In 1949, the West formed NATO. The whole idea was simple but powerful. An attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. It took a few years, but in 1955, the Soviet Union fired back with its own club, the Warsaw Pact, locking down its allies in Eastern Europe into one unified military bloc.
Oh, and it definitely didn't stop in Europe. The US had this core strategy called containment, which was basically about building a firewall to stop communism from spreading. So they created this whole global web of alliances, pacts like SEATO in Southeast Asia and CENTO in the Middle East. All told, the US built partnerships with more than 40 countries to try and hem the Soviets in. Now you've got these two massive, armed camps staring each other down across the globe. But this wasn't just a political standoff. They knew they couldn't risk a direct fight, so the Cold War found other ways to get hot, and incredibly violent.
To really get how they fought, you have to understand this idea, the proxy war. I mean, it's a terrifyingly clever strategy. It allows the US and the USSR to fight each other, but using someone else's country and someone else's soldiers to do the bleeding. They'd back opposing sides, flood them with money and weapons, and basically turn local conflicts into a battle for global supremacy.
And the first big, bloody test of this whole proxy war playbook, that was Korea. After World War II, the peninsula was chopped in half, a Soviet-backed north and a US-backed south. In 1950, the North invaded, and suddenly the world was watching this brutal, full-scale war unfold.
And just look at that number, nearly 4 million people. That is the devastating human cost of a proxy war. The superpowers themselves didn't declare war, but their conflict in Korea led to an unbelievable death toll. And in the end, a stalemate. The peninsula is still divided to this day.
And then, of course, came Vietnam. This one didn't happen overnight. It was this slow, gradual slide into a nightmare. It started small, with Eisenhower sending a few military advisors. Kennedy sent even more to look tough. But it was Johnson who went all in, convinced by the domino theory, the fear that if Vietnam fell to communism, all of Southeast Asia would be next. And this chess game was being played all over the board, not just in Asia. In Nicaragua, the US secretly funded rebels to overthrow a socialist government. And in Angola, a brutal civil war became a free-for-all, with the US, the Soviets, Cuba, and even South Africa all jumping in to back different sides.
For decades, they played this dangerous game of proxy wars, always keeping their distance. But there was one moment, one terrifying moment, where the game stopped, the masks came off, and the two superpowers stared each other directly in the eyes. For 13 days, the entire world held its breath.
And the powder keg was Cuba. After Fidel Castro's revolution, suddenly there was a communist state, a Soviet ally just off the coast of Florida. For the United States, this was an absolute red line, an existential threat right on its doorstep.
Look at how fast this went down. On October 14th, spy planes spotted Soviet nuclear missiles being set up in Cuba. 8 days later, Kennedy goes on TV and announces a naval blockade, he called it a quarantine, around the island. For nearly 2 weeks, the world watched as Soviet ships sailed right toward that line, bringing humanity to the absolute razor's edge of nuclear war.
So how did we all survive? Well, it came down to a very tense backroom deal. The Soviet leader, Khrushchev, agreed to take the missiles out of Cuba. In exchange, the U.S. made a public promise that it would never invade the island. But there was also a secret part of the deal. The U.S. quietly agreed to remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey, right on the Soviet border. You know, when you stare into the abyss like that, it changes you. And that's what happened here. The Cuban Missile Crisis scared the world and its leaders so badly that they knew something fundamental had to change. They just couldn't risk coming that close to Armageddon ever again.
So they started taking these small, careful steps back from the edge. First, they set up the hotline, basically a direct phone between Washington and Moscow so they could actually talk during a crisis. Then came treaties to ban most nuclear bomb tests, and maybe most important, a treaty to try and stop the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries.
And it wasn't just the politicians who were scared. All over the world, ordinary people were terrified. A huge anti-nuclear movement was born. In 1982, this number, 1 million people, marched in New York City alone to demand an end to the arms race. It was an absolutely incredible display of public pressure.
So when you boil it all down, what was the superpower playbook? Well, they built huge military alliances to force everyone to pick a side, they fueled brutal proxy wars to fight without fighting directly, and they used the constant, terrifying threat of nuclear weapons as the ultimate bargaining chip, all while propping up friendly governments with cash and weapons.
Which brings us to a final thought for today. The Cold War might be over, but its tactics? Maybe not. In a world where conflicts are fought with cyber attacks, economic sanctions, and disinformation campaigns, you have to wonder, have the proxy wars of the Cold War just changed their uniform? Something to think about. Thanks for watching.